when exhausted CEO Clara Whitmore accidentally fell asleep on single father Daniel Hayes's shoulder during a turbulent flight. She had no idea that this moment of vulnerability would shatter every wall she'd built around her heart. What happened next in the cramped airplane cabin would change 3 lives forever. Hers, his, and his critically ill son's. Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey, and comment below what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story of unexpected love has traveled across the world. The fluorescent lights of Boston Logan International Airport buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Clara Whitmore strode through Terminal C, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor with the precision of a metronome. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in her company's 100-year history, a fact that the business magazines never tired of mentioning, alongside photos of her sharp suits and sharper gaze. Today, however, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, weighing down her usually perfect posture. She hadn't slept properly in 72 hours. The merger with Thornfield Industries had hit every possible snag, from regulatory hurdles to last-minute contract disputes. Her legal team had worked through the night, fueled by espresso and sheer determination, finally closing the deal at 4:47 a.m. Now, at 2:15 p.m., Clara was running on fumes and caffeine, her body demanding rest that her schedule simply wouldn't allow. The boarding announcement for Flight 447 to Seattle echoed through the terminal, and Clara quickened her pace. She had exactly 3 hours and 27 minutes of flight time to review the Henderson account before her 7 p.m. dinner meeting with potential investors. Sleep wasn't an option. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. Lost in her mental calculations, Clara didn't see the man crouched near Gate 17 until it was too late. The collision was spectacular in its awkwardness. Her leather briefcase flew from her grip, papers scattering like startled birds across the gate area. Her phone skittered across the floor, its screen spiderwebbing against the metal leg of a chair. And there, rolling in a lazy arc before coming to rest against her Louboutin pump, was a small, red toy airplane, its paint chipped and faded from countless hours of play. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." The voice was rich and warm, tinged with genuine distress. "I was just... Ethan dropped his plane and I was trying to..." Clara looked up from the chaos of scattered documents to see a man scrambling to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His jeans were worn but clean, and his navy sweater had the soft, lived-in quality that spoke of countless washings. Everything about him screamed ordinary middle class, every day, the complete opposite of the polished executives and venture capitalists who populated Clara's world. No, it's my fault," Clara said automatically, though her tone suggested otherwise. She was already calculating the time lost, the inconvenience, the potential damage to her presentation materials. "I wasn't watching where I was going." The man Daniel, she would later learn, was gathering her papers with careful hands, treating each document as if it were precious rather than the corporate jargon it actually contained. "Are you hurt? You hit that pillar pretty hard." Clara touched her shoulder gingerly. There would definitely be a bruise tomorrow, but she'd endured worse in the corporate battlefield. "I'm fine. Really." But as she bent to retrieve her cracked phone, a wave of dizziness swept over her. The terminal tilted slightly, and she had to grip the arm of a nearby chair to steady herself. The lack of sleep, the stress, the endless pressure, it was all catching up to her at the worst possible moment. "Hey, are you sure you're okay?" Daniel's voice was closer now, concerned. "You look pretty pale." "I said I'm fine," Clara snapped, then immediately regretted her tone. The man was just trying to help, and here she was taking out her frustration on a complete stranger. She forced her voice into something resembling politeness. "Thank you for helping with the papers. Daniel handed her the neatly stacked documents, and their fingers brushed for just a moment. His hands were calloused. She noticed the hands of someone who worked with them for a living. There was something grounding about that touch, something real in a world that felt increasingly artificial. "Daddy, did you find Mr. Zoom?" A small voice piped up from behind Daniel, and Clara turned to see a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. He was pale, too pale, with dark circles under eyes that were far too serious for his age. Despite his obvious illness, there was something luminous about him, a brightness that seemed to emanate from within. "Right here, buddy," Daniel said, scooping up the red airplane and handing it to his son. "Mr. Zoom just went on a little adventure." The boy Ethan clutched the toy to his chest like a lifeline. "Is he okay? He didn't get hurt, did he?" Clara watched this exchange with something approaching fascination. In her world, children were abstract concepts mentioned briefly in board meetings when discussing family-friendly policies or target demographics. She couldn't remember the last time she'd actually spoken to a child, let alone witnessed such pure, uncomplicated love between a parent and their offspring. "Mr. Zoom is just fine," Daniel assured his son, ruffling his hair gently. "He's excited about flying on the big airplane today. Now boarding Group A, Flight 447 to Seattle," the gate agent announced, and Clara felt her stomach clench. She needed to get on that plane, needed to use every minute of flight time to prepare for the evening's meeting. But something kept her rooted to the spot, watching, as Daniel helped his son organize a small backpack filled with coloring books, crayons, and what looked like medication bottles. "Excuse me," she found herself saying, addressing Daniel. "Are you on the Seattle flight?" He looked up, surprised. "Yes, we are. Ethan has a specialist appointment at Children's Hospital tomorrow morning." The way he said it, casual, but with an undercurrent of barely controlled anxiety, told Clara everything she needed to know about the nature of that appointment. This wasn't a routine checkup. This was the kind of appointment that kept parents awake at night, staring at the ceiling, and bargaining with whatever gods they believed in. "I hope everything goes well," she said, and meant it. It was such a small thing to say, such an inadequate response to what was clearly a monumental worry, but Daniel's face lit up as if she'd offered him something precious. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means more than you know." The boarding process began in earnest, and Clara found herself in line behind Daniel and Ethan. She couldn't help but notice how carefully Daniel managed every aspect of their journey, ensuring Ethan had his inhaler easily accessible, checking that his boarding pass was secure, whispering quiet encouragements when the boy seemed overwhelmed by the crowds and noise. "Now boarding Group B," came the announcement, and Clara realized with a start that she was in Group A. She should have been on the plane already, settling into her first-class seat and spreading out her work materials. Instead, she was standing here inexplicably reluctant to leave this father and son behind. "You can go ahead," Daniel said, noticing her hesitation. "We're in Group C anyway." But Clara shook her head. "It's fine. I'm not in any hurry." It was a lie, of course. She was always in a hurry. Her entire life was structured around deadlines and schedules and the relentless pursuit of the next deal, the next acquisition, the next mountain to climb. But something about Ethan's pale face and Daniel's quiet strength made her usual priorities seem suddenly less urgent. When they finally boarded the plane, Clara was surprised to discover that her first-class seat was directly across the aisle from where Daniel and Ethan were settling into their economy seats. She watched through her peripheral vision as Daniel helped his son buckle his seatbelt, showed him how to adjust the air vent, and pulled out a small tablet loaded with what appeared to be educational games. "Can I get you anything to drink before takeoff?" the flight attendant asked Clara, and she requested her usual black coffee, no sugar. but her attention was still focused on the conversation happening across the aisle. "How long until we get there, Daddy?" Ethan was asking, his voice small and tired. "About 3.5 hours," Daniel replied, checking his watch. "But remember what we talked about, time goes faster when you're having fun. We can play games, or you can draw, or we can read that new book about airplanes." "Will Dr. Martinez be nice?" Ethan asked, and Clara heard the fear beneath the carefully brave tone. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dr. Martinez is one of the best doctors in the whole country, buddy. She's going to take really good care of you." "But what if she says I need more medicine, the kind that makes me feel sick?" Clara felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. She'd never been particularly maternal, had never felt the biological clock that so many of her female colleagues complained about. Children were foreign creatures to her, unpredictable and exhausting, and generally incompatible with her carefully ordered existence. But there was something about Ethan's quiet courage, his determination to be brave despite his obvious fear, that reached past all her defenses and grabbed hold of something she didn't even know existed. "Hey," Daniel said, his voice gentle but firm. "Remember what we always say about worrying. Worrying about tomorrow steals today's happiness," Ethan recited dutifully. "That's right. So today, we're going to focus on our airplane adventure. We're going to see clouds from above, and maybe we'll spot some other planes, and when we land, we'll get to see the Space Needle. And the fish market." "And the fish market," Daniel confirmed with a smile. "But you have to promise me you won't ask to buy a whole salmon again." And despite everything, the obvious illness, the looming medical appointment, the financial strain that Clara could read in the careful way Daniel counted his cash, Ethan giggled. It was a sound like silver bells, pure and bright and utterly infectious. The plane began to taxi, and Clara forced herself to look away to focus on her laptop screen and the Henderson presentation. But concentration proved elusive. Every few minutes she found her gaze drifting across the aisle, watching, as Daniel patiently helped Ethan with a coloring book, or explained how airplane engines worked, or simply held his son's hand during the more turbulent moments of takeoff. It was a masterclass in patience and devotion, and it made Clara uncomfortably aware of how transactional most of her relationships were. When was the last time someone had looked at her, the way Ethan looked at his father, with complete trust and unconditional love? When was the last time she'd felt anything approaching that level of connection with another human being? The answer, she realized with uncomfortable clarity, was never. An hour into the flight, Clara's exhaustion finally began to overwhelm her caffeine-fueled determination. The Henderson presentation blurred before her eyes, the carefully crafted bullet points running together into meaningless shapes. She rubbed her temples, trying to ward off the headache building behind her eyes, but it was a losing battle. She'd been running on adrenaline and stubbornness for so long that she'd forgotten what actual tiredness felt like. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, though her body certainly craved rest. It was a soul-deep weariness, the kind that came from years of carefully constructed emotional distance, from treating every interaction as a potential business opportunity, from never allowing herself to be vulnerable or genuine or human. "Excuse me, miss?" The voice was small and hesitant, and Clara looked up to find Ethan standing in the aisle beside her seat. "Are you okay? You look sad." Clara blinked momentarily, speechless. When was the last time a child had spoken to her with such direct compassion? When was the last time anyone had, "I'm fine, sweetheart," she managed, using the same automatic response she'd given his father earlier. But Ethan's serious dark eyes seemed to see right through her practiced facade. "My daddy says sometimes grown-ups say they're fine when they're really not," Ethan observed with the brutal honesty that only children possessed. He says it's because grown-ups think they have to be strong all the time, but everyone needs help sometimes. From across the aisle, Daniel appeared looking mortified. Ethan, buddy, you can't just walk up to strangers and— It's okay, Clara said quickly, surprised by how much she meant it. He's not bothering me. Daniel looked skeptical, but he didn't immediately drag his son away. Instead, he stood uncertainly in the narrow aisle, one hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. I was telling the nice lady about how sometimes grown-ups say they're fine when they're not. Ethan explained to his father with the air of someone sharing profound wisdom. Did you now? Daniel's cheeks flushed slightly. Well, that's very observant of you, but maybe the nice lady would like to get back to her work. Clara looked down at her laptop at the presentation that suddenly seemed completely irrelevant. Actually, she heard herself saying, I could use a break from work. Ethan's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? Do you want to see my coloring book? I'm drawing an airplane family. And that was how Clara Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries, found herself examining a 7-year-old's artwork while 30,000 feet above the American heartland. Ethan's airplane family consisted of 3 planes of different sizes, a large blue one, a medium red one, and a tiny yellow one that he'd labeled Baby Zoom. That's Mr. Zoom, Ethan explained, pointing to the red plane. He's been with me since I was little, and that's Mama Zoom and Baby Zoom. They all fly together so they don't get lonely. Clara studied the drawing with the same intensity she usually reserved for financial reports. There was something both heartbreaking and beautiful about the boy's imagination, the way he'd created an entire family dynamic for his toy airplanes. It spoke to a need for connection, for belonging, that resonated more deeply than she wanted to admit. Does Mr. Zoom have any adventures? She asked, genuinely curious. Ethan's eyes widened with excitement. Oh yes, he's been to the hospital lots of times with me, and he's flown over mountains and oceans, and once he even helped Santa deliver presents when Rudolph was sick. Ethan, Daniel said gently, maybe we should let the lady get back to her. Please, Clara interrupted, looking directly at Daniel for the first time since the collision at the gate. I'd like to hear about Mr. Zoom's adventures. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement of shared humanity. Daniel's expression softened, and he settled into the empty seat next to Clara. The flight wasn't full, and the attendants seemed to be looking the other way. For the next hour, Clara found herself drawn into Ethan's imaginative world of brave toy airplanes and their heroic adventures. She learned that Mr. Zoom had once rescued a kitten from a tree by flying very carefully so as not to scare it, had delivered medicine to sick children in faraway countries, and had been Ethan's faithful companion through countless medical procedures. He's not scared of doctors or needles or anything, Ethan confided, clutching the worn toy to his chest. And when I hold him, I'm not scared either. Clara felt something twist in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name, but that left her oddly breathless. That's very brave of both of you, she said softly. Daddy says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. Ethan continued with the matter-of-fact tone children used when sharing universal truths. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. Clara glanced at Daniel, who was watching his son with an expression of such pure love and pride that it was almost painful to witness. This man, she realized, was raising an extraordinary human being under circumstances that would have broken lesser people. The quiet strength she'd sensed earlier wasn't an act or a facade. It was the real thing, forged in the fires of single parenthood and medical uncertainty. Your daddy sounds very wise, Clara said, and she meant it. Daniel's smile was small but genuine. He's the one who's wise. I'm just trying to keep up. The conversation might have continued, but at that moment, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence that had the cabin bucking like an angry bull. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and passengers grabbed for their armrests as the aircraft lurched and shuddered through the unstable air. Ethan immediately began to whimper, his earlier bravery deserting him in the face of the violent motion. Daniel quickly moved back to his own seat, gathering his son into his arms and whispering soothing words that Clara couldn't quite make out over the drone of the engines and the worried murmurs of other passengers. The turbulence seemed to go on forever, though it was probably only minutes. Clara gripped her own armrests, her knuckles white with tension, her carefully controlled exterior finally showing cracks. She'd always hated flying, not the takeoffs and landings, but these moments when the plane reminded everyone aboard that they were essentially trapped in a metal tube hurtling through space at impossible speeds. But it wasn't the turbulence itself that was bothering her. It was the sound of Ethan's quiet sobs, the way Daniel's voice stayed calm and reassuring, even though she could see the tension in his shoulders, the fear in his eyes. This child was already facing so much illness, medical procedures, uncertainty about his future, and now he had to endure this terror as well. Without really thinking about what she was doing, Clara found herself reaching across the aisle, her hand extended toward Ethan. The boy looked at her through tear-filled eyes, seemed to consider for a moment, then tentatively reached out to grasp her fingers. His hand was so small, so fragile, that Clara felt a fierce protective instinct she'd never experienced before. She'd built her career on being tough, on never showing weakness, on maintaining emotional distance from everyone and everything. But this child's trust, freely given to a virtual stranger, shattered every defense she'd ever constructed. "It's okay," she heard herself saying, her voice surprisingly steady. "The pilot knows what he's doing. We're going to be fine." Daniel looked at her with something approaching wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe that this polished professional woman was comforting his son. But Clara barely noticed his expression. Her entire focus was on Ethan, on the way his breathing gradually slowed, as she spoke to him in soft, soothing tones she didn't even recognize as her own voice. "My daddy says turbulence is just the airplane dancing with the wind," Ethan said, his voice still shaky but no longer panicked. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Clara replied. "Maybe the airplane is learning new dance steps." The boy managed a watery smile. "Mr. Zoom likes to dance too. Sometimes I make him do loop-de-loops. I bet he's very good at it." By the time the turbulence finally subsided and the seatbelt sign chimed off, something fundamental had shifted. Clara wasn't entirely sure what had happened, but she knew with absolute certainty that she was not the same person who had boarded this plane in Boston. The walls she'd spent years building around her heart had developed cracks, and through those cracks light was beginning to seep in. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, once Ethan had settled back into his coloring book. You didn't have to do that." Clara shrugged, suddenly feeling awkward and uncertain. "It was nothing." "No," Daniel said firmly. "It wasn't nothing. Not to him and not to me." There was something in his voice, a depth of gratitude that made Clara uncomfortable in ways she couldn't articulate. She wasn't used to being needed, wasn't used to people depending on her for anything beyond business acumen and strategic thinking. The idea that her simple gesture had meant something to this father and son was both humbling and terrifying. "He's a special kid," she said finally, because it was true and because she didn't know what else to say. "He is," Daniel agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "He's been through more in his 7 years than most people face in a lifetime, and he still finds ways to make others smile. I don't know how he does it." Clara wanted to ask about Ethan's condition, about the medical appointments, and the obvious worry that Daniel carried like a physical weight. But something held her back, maybe respect for their privacy, or maybe fear of hearing something that would make the growing ache in her chest even worse. Instead, she found herself asking, "Are you visiting Seattle or is it home?" "Home," Daniel replied. "Well, as much home as anywhere, I suppose. We've moved around a lot for Ethan's treatment. Boston was just a consultation with a specialist there. Seattle is where his main medical team is based." "That must be difficult, all the traveling, I mean." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "You do what you have to do for your kids, you know the rest of it. The logistics, the expenses, the disruption, it's all just details." But Clara was good at reading between the lines, and she could hear the strain beneath his casual words. The careful way he'd counted his cash at the gate, the economy seats, despite his son's obvious need for comfort. The worn quality of their clothes despite their cleanliness. It all painted a picture of a man doing everything possible for his child while struggling to make ends meet. "What do you do for work?" she asked, then immediately wondered if she was being too intrusive. But Daniel seemed happy enough to talk about safer topics. "I'm in construction renovation work mostly. Historic buildings, old houses that need careful restoration. It's good work when you can get it, and it's flexible enough that I can arrange my schedule around Ethan's appointments." Clara nodded, filing away this information, along with everything else she was learning about this unexpected father-son duo. Daniel's hands made sense now, the calluses, the careful way he handled things, the quiet competence that seemed to inform everything he did. "That sounds interesting," she said, and meant it. In her world of mergers and acquisitions of abstract financial instruments and corporate maneuvering, there was something appealing about work that created tangible results that preserved and restored, rather than simply consumed and discarded. "It is," Daniel replied, his face lighting up slightly. "There's something satisfying about taking something old and broken and making it beautiful again. Every building has a story. You know, my job is just helping that story continue." Before Clara could respond, Ethan's voice piped up from across the aisle. "Daddy's really good at fixing things. He fixed my bike and he made me a bookshelf that looks like a castle, and he even fixed Mr. Zoom when his wing broke." "Did he now?" Clara looked at the toy airplane with new interest. "That must have been quite an operation." "It was touch and go for a while," Daniel said solemnly, playing along with his son's drama. "But Mr. Zoom is tougher than he looks." "Just like Ethan," the boy announced proudly, and Clara felt that twist in her chest again, sharper this time. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of quiet conversation and comfortable silences. Clara found herself drawn into their orbit, despite every instinct that told her to maintain her distance to protect herself from the complications that emotional involvement invariably brought. But there was something irresistible about their easy dynamic, the way Daniel balanced gentle authority with genuine affection, the way Ethan's bright spirit shone through, despite his obvious physical challenges. By the time the pilot announced their initial descent into Seattle, Clara had learned more about this father and son than she knew about most of her own employees. She knew that Ethan's favorite color was red, like Mr. Zoom, that Daniel made the world's best pancakes according to his son, and that they had a tradition of rating the clouds they saw from airplane windows on a scale of 1 to 10. "Those are definitely 10s, Ethan declared, pressing his face to the small window as they descended through a spectacular display of billowing white clouds touched with gold from the setting sun. "I don't know," Daniel said thoughtfully, craning his neck to see past his son. "I think those might be 11s. "There's no such thing as 11, Ethan protested, giggling. "Says who? This is our rating system. We can make the rules. Clara watched this exchange with something approaching envy. When was the last time she'd allowed herself such simple pleasure? When was the last time she'd looked at clouds and seen anything other than potential weather delays? What do you think? Daniel asked suddenly, and Clara realized he was addressing her. Professional opinion on the cloud situation. She leaned over to look out Ethan's window, acutely aware of how close she was to both of them. How natural this felt, despite being completely outside her normal experience. The clouds were indeed spectacular, towering cumulus formations, painted in shades of gold and pink and deep orange by the setting sun. Definitely 11s, she said solemnly. Maybe even 12s. Ethan's delighted laughter was worth any awkwardness she might have felt about joining their game. And the look Daniel gave her, surprised, grateful, maybe even a little bit wondering, made something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with airplane turbulence. As they began their final descent, the reality of their situation began to reassert itself. This interlude, whatever it had been, was about to end. Clara would return to her hotel, prepare for her dinner meeting, and continue with the carefully structured life she'd built for herself. Daniel and Ethan would face whatever tomorrow's medical appointment would bring. They would probably never see each other again. The thought was more disappointing than it should have been. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, the pilot announced. Please ensure your seats are in their upright positions and your tray tables are stowed. Clara mechanically followed the pre-landing routine, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself memorizing details, the way Ethan carefully tucked Mr. Zoom into his backpack, the gentle way Daniel helped his son prepare for landing, the quiet courage they both displayed in the face of uncertainty. The plane touched down with barely a bump, and passengers immediately began the familiar ritual of gathering belongings and jockeying for position in the aisles. But Clara remained seated, reluctant to break the spell that had somehow woven itself around the three of them during the flight. Well, Daniel said, as passengers began filing past them toward the exit. I guess this is where we part ways. I guess it is so, Clara replied, but she made no move to stand. Ethan, however, had no such hesitation. Before anyone could stop him, he launched himself across the aisle and wrapped his small arms around Clara's neck in an impulsive hug that caught her completely off guard. Thank you for being nice to me, he whispered against her ear. I hope you have good dreams tonight. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Actual tears, something she hadn't experienced in a professional context in years. She hugged the boy back, marveling at how such a small person could carry such enormous grace and kindness. Thank you for sharing your airplane stories with me, she whispered back. Take good care of Mr. Zoom. When Ethan finally released her and returned to his father's side, Clara had to take a moment to compose herself. Daniel was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part gratitude, part curiosity, part something else entirely. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. You made a difficult journey much easier for both of us. Clara wanted to say something meaningful, something that would convey how much this unexpected encounter had affected her. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded and watched as Daniel gathered their belongings and guided Ethan toward the exit. They paused at the end of the jetway, and for a moment Clara thought Daniel might turn back, might say something more. But then the crowd of departing passengers swept them away, and they were gone, leaving Clara alone with her cracked phone and her scattered thoughts, and the strange feeling that something important had just walked out of her life. She sat in the empty airplane for several more minutes, ostensibly organizing her papers, but really just trying to process what had happened. 3 hours ago, she'd been a focused, driven executive with a clear agenda, and no time for distractions. Now she felt unmoored, as if some fundamental assumption about herself and her priorities had been quietly dismantled during the course of the flight. The Henderson presentation lay forgotten in her lap, its carefully crafted arguments suddenly seeming hollow and meaningless. What was the point of acquiring another company, of expanding market share and maximizing shareholder value, when there were children like Ethan facing uncertain futures, when there were fathers like Daniel struggling to provide hope and stability, while their world tilted on its axis? Clara finally forced herself to stand and gather her belongings. She had a job to do, responsibilities to fulfill, a life to return to. But as she walked through the jetway and into the bustle of the Seattle airport, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something vital behind, something she hadn't even known she'd been missing until she'd found it in the most unexpected place. The evening stretched before her, full of the usual obligations and opportunities. But for the first time in her professional life, Clara Whitmore found herself wondering if there might be something more important than the next deal, the next acquisition, the next rung on the ladder of success. And somewhere in the depths of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, a small boy clutched a red toy airplane and asked his father if they might see the nice lady again someday. The Seattle Marriott's marble lobby gleamed under crystal chandeliers as Clara stepped through the revolving doors, her heels once again finding their familiar rhythm against polished stone. But something had fundamentally shifted during those 3 hours and 27 minutes in the air. The sound felt hollow now, almost performative, as if she were playing a role she'd suddenly forgotten how to inhabit. "Ms. Whitmore," the concierge's voice cut through her reverie. "Your dinner reservation at Canlis has been confirmed for 7:30. Shall I arrange transportation?" Clara checked her watch, 6:15 p.m. Plenty of time to shower change into her power suit and mentally prepare for the evening's performance. The Henderson Group executives expected the sharp, focused CEO who had built Whitmore Industries from a mid-sized family business into a major player in the tech consulting world. They had no use for a woman whose thoughts kept drifting to a 7-year-old boy's airplane stories and his father's storm cloud eyes. "Yes, thank you," she replied automatically, then hesitated. "Actually, make that 8 o'clock. I need some extra time to prepare." The concierge nodded efficiently, and Clara found herself in the elevator watching the floors tick by as she rose toward the penthouse suite. But instead of reviewing her talking points or mentally rehearsing her presentation, she kept replaying moments from the flight, Ethan's small hand in hers during the turbulence, Daniel's surprised smile when she'd joined their cloud rating game, the boy's whispered thanks that had somehow managed to crack something open inside her chest. Her suite was everything she'd come to expect from 5-star hotels, impeccably decorated, professionally serviced, and utterly soulless. She'd stayed in hundreds of similar rooms over the years, and they all blended together in a blur of Egyptian cotton sheets and marble bathrooms and views that might as well have been expensive paintings for all the connection she felt to them. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive rather than peaceful. She found herself gravitating toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of Elliott Bay, its dark waters dotted with the lights of ferries and pleasure craft. Somewhere out there in the sprawling city, Daniel and Ethan were settling into their own accommodations, probably a modest hotel. Near the hospital, she guessed nothing like the luxury that surrounded her now. Clara's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Henderson Group confirmed for 8 p.m. Preliminary contracts attached. Break a leg." She should have been reviewing those contracts, memorizing key figures and strategic advantages. Instead, she found herself thinking about what Daniel had said about restoration work, taking something old and broken and making it beautiful again. When was the last time she'd created something beautiful? When was the last time she'd done work that actually mattered to someone beyond a board of directors and their shareholders? The question troubled her more than it should have. She'd built her career on being rational, on making decisions based on data and market analysis rather than emotion. But the encounter on the plane had stirred up feelings she'd thought she'd successfully buried years ago, doubts about the path she'd chosen, questions about what constituted a life well lived. Her shower was longer than usual, as if she could wash away the uncertainty that had taken root during the flight. But when she emerged and began the familiar ritual of preparing for battle, the tailored suit, the strategic application of makeup, the careful styling of her hair into its signature chignon, she found herself moving through the motions like an actress preparing for a role she no longer believed in. The driver was punctual as always, and the ride to Canlis passed in a blur of Seattle's evening traffic. Clara tried to focus on her phone, on the endless stream of emails and updates that normally commanded her full attention. But her concentration kept fracturing her thoughts, drifting back to the airplane, and the unexpected connection she'd felt with two strangers who were now facing an uncertain medical diagnosis. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel was helping Ethan settle into their room at the Hampton Inn, a far cry from Clara's luxury suite, but clean and comfortable and within their carefully managed budget. The boy was tired from the long day of travel, but too anxious about tomorrow's appointment to sleep easily. "Can we call and check on Mr. Zoom's cousins?" Ethan asked, referring to a collection of toy airplanes they'd left with their neighbor back home. It was a nightly ritual when they traveled, one that helped ease the transition of sleeping in unfamiliar places. "Of course, buddy," Daniel replied, pulling out his phone. "But first, let's get you into your pajamas and brush your teeth." As Ethan padded toward the bathroom, Daniel found himself thinking about the woman from the plane. Clara. She'd never actually introduced herself, he realized, but he'd caught sight of her name on some of the papers that had scattered during their initial collision. Clara Whitmore. Something about the name nagged at him, as if he should recognize it, but he couldn't quite place where he might have heard it before. What struck him most was how she'd transformed during the flight. The sharp, businesslike exterior had gradually given way to something warmer, more genuine. When she'd comforted Ethan during the turbulence, when she'd joined their silly cloud rating game, she'd seemed almost surprised by her own kindness, as if she were discovering aspects of herself she'd forgotten existed. "Daddy, I can't reach the toothpaste," Ethan called from the bathroom, and Daniel pushed thoughts of mysterious fellow passengers aside to focus on the evening routine that had become their anchor in the chaos of medical uncertainties. But as he helped his son prepare for bed, as they went through their nightly checklist of medications and comfort items, and reassuring conversations about tomorrow, Daniel couldn't shake the memory of Clara's expression when Ethan had hugged her goodbye. For just a moment, her carefully controlled facade had cracked completely, revealing something raw and vulnerable and achingly lonely beneath. Back at Canlis, Clara was navigating the familiar choreography of a business dinner with practiced ease. The Henderson Group executives were exactly what she'd expected: intelligent, ambitious, and laser-focused on the bottom line. The conversation flowed smoothly through market analysis and growth projections, acquisition strategies, and synergistic opportunities. "The Asian markets represent our biggest area for expansion," Richard Henderson was saying, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "Your company's expertise in cross-cultural consulting could be invaluable in facilitating that growth." Clara nodded, offering the expected insights about regulatory environments and cultural sensitivities. But part of her attention kept drifting to the restaurant's windows, where the lights of Seattle twinkled like earthbound stars. Somewhere out there, a little boy was probably struggling to fall asleep in a strange bed, worried about what tomorrow's doctor would tell him and his father. "Ms. Whitmore," Henderson's voice cut through her wandering thoughts. "What are your thoughts on the timeline for integration?" Clara blinked, refocusing with effort. I apologize. Could you repeat the question? I was just considering some of the implementation complexities. It was a smooth recovery, the kind of professional grace note she'd perfected over years of high-stakes negotiations. But inside she felt off balance in a way that was both unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. When had she last lost focus during a business meeting? When had anything mattered more than the deal at hand? The dinner continued for another hour, touching on all the expected topics: due diligence timelines, employee retention strategies, potential cost savings through operational efficiencies. Clara performed her role flawlessly, asking the right questions and providing the expected reassurances. But it felt increasingly surreal, like watching herself from a great distance. I think we have the foundation for a very successful partnership, Henderson concluded as they prepared to leave. I'll have my team send over the preliminary agreements tomorrow morning. I look forward to reviewing them, Clara replied automatically. But as she shook hands and exchanged business cards and made all the appropriate closing gestures, she found herself wondering if this was really what she wanted. Another acquisition, another expansion, another step up a ladder that seemed to lead nowhere but higher into increasingly rarefied air. The ride back to her hotel passed in contemplative silence. Seattle's evening energy flowed around her couples, walking hand in hand, families gathered around restaurant windows, the vibrant pulse of a city settling into its nighttime rhythm. But Clara felt separate from all of it, enclosed in her professional bubble like a deep-sea diver, observing life from behind thick glass. Her suite felt even more oppressive when she returned the luxury appointments, seeming almost mocking in their perfection. She poured herself a glass of wine from the complimentary bottle and stood again at the windows looking out over a city where 8 million stories were unfolding simultaneously. Most of those stories, she realized, probably had nothing to do with market share or profit margins or strategic positioning. Her phone rang, startling her from her reverie. The caller ID showed her assistant's number, though it was well past normal business hours. Sarah, is everything all right? I'm sorry to bother you so late. Sarah's voice was tight with concern. But I just got a call from the Henderson Group. They want to move up the timeline significantly. They're talking about signing preliminary agreements tomorrow afternoon instead of next week. Clara felt a familiar spike of adrenaline, the thrill of a deal accelerating toward closure. This was what she lived for. The high-stakes negotiations, the strategic maneuvering, the moment when months of careful planning came together in a decisive victory. What's driving the urgency? She asked, already shifting into battle mode. Apparently, their main competitor is sniffing around a similar deal with Morrison Consulting. Henderson wants to lock us in before they lose their window. Clara was quiet for a moment, calculating options and contingencies. This was exactly the kind of opportunity that had built her career, the chance to outmaneuver the competition and secure a game-changing partnership. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have hesitated. Hell, 6 hours ago, she wouldn't have hesitated. But now she found herself thinking about Daniel's words regarding restoration work, taking something old and broken and making it beautiful again. What was beautiful about acquiring another company, about absorbing their workforce and streamlining their operations and extracting maximum value for shareholders who already had more money than they could spend in several lifetimes? Ms. Whitmore, are you there? Yes, Clara said slowly. Yes, I'm here. Tell Henderson we'll meet at 10 a.m. tomorrow. But I want our legal team to review everything thoroughly before we commit to anything. Of course, I'll make the arrangements. After ending the call, Clara found herself pacing the suite's living area, restless energy coursing through her like electricity. This should have been a moment of triumph, the culmination of weeks of careful preparation. Instead, she felt oddly hollow, as if she were celebrating someone else's victory. She tried to focus on the positive aspects of the deal, the jobs it would create, the growth opportunities for both companies, the innovative solutions they could develop together. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the airplane, to a conversation about being brave, even when you're scared, to the way a 7-year-old boy had unselfconsciously shared his imagination with a stressed stranger. Unable to settle, Clara found herself at her laptop, not reviewing contracts or financial projections, but searching for information about pediatric specialists in Seattle. She told herself it was idle curiosity, but she knew better. Something about Ethan's quiet courage and Daniel's devoted protectiveness had gotten under her skin in a way that no business challenge ever had. The search results painted a picture of cutting-edge medical facilities and renowned specialists, but also of families navigating impossibly complex healthcare systems while dealing with devastating diagnoses. The stories were heartbreaking parents mortgaging their homes to pay for experimental treatments, children facing procedures that would challenge the bravest adults, families torn apart by the stress of medical uncertainty. Clara found herself wondering how Daniel managed it all: the medical appointments, the financial pressure, the emotional weight of being solely responsible for his son's well-being. The strength required was incomprehensible to someone whose biggest challenges involved stock prices and market positioning. Her wine sat forgotten as she delved deeper into articles about childhood illness and single parenthood, about the hidden costs of medical care, and the gaps in insurance coverage that left families vulnerable. It was a world she'd never had reason to explore before, but one that suddenly felt urgently important to understand. A soft chime from her phone indicated a new email, probably Henderson's team sending additional documents for tomorrow's meeting. But when Clara checked the screen, she was surprised to see a message from an address she didn't recognize with a subject line that made her heart skip. "Thank you from Ethan and his dad." She opened it with trembling fingers. "Dear Clara." The message began, and she was struck immediately by the informal tone, so different from the corporate communications that filled her inbox. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out. Ethan insisted I find a way to contact you after we got to our hotel. He wanted to make sure you got settled safely, and to thank you again for being so kind during the flight. I managed to track down your email through your company website. I remembered your name from the papers that scattered at the airport." Clara's breath caught. Daniel had taken the time to search for her to reach out across the vast anonymity of modern life. The gesture was so thoughtful, so unexpected, that she had to read the paragraph twice before continuing. "I know you probably have important business to attend to in Seattle, but if you find yourself with any free time, Ethan would love to show you the Space Needle tomorrow afternoon. He's been talking non-stop about cloud formations and airplane families since we landed. We'll be at Children's Hospital most of the morning for his appointment, but we're planning to do some sightseeing afterward, assuming everything goes well with Dr. Martinez." The message continued with practical details, contact information, suggested meeting times alternatives in case their medical appointment ran long. But Clara found herself focusing on the casual assumption that she might want to spend her afternoon with a 7-year-old and his father, that such a thing would even be possible given her schedule and responsibilities. "I understand if you're too busy," the email concluded. "Business travels can be demanding, and we're essentially strangers who happen to share a flight. But Ethan made me promise to ask. He said you looked like you could use an adventure, and he's usually pretty good at reading people. Either way, thank you again for making a difficult journey easier for both of us. Your kindness meant more than you know. Daniel Hayes." Clara stared at the screen for a long time, rereading the message and trying to process the unexpected invitation. She had the Henderson meeting at 10, followed by what would undoubtedly be hours of legal reviews and contract negotiations. Her evening flight back to Boston was at 7:30, giving her just enough time to wrap up the deal and return to her carefully ordered life. But as she sat in her sterile hotel suite surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly felt like walls, Clara found herself composing a response before she could talk herself out of it. "Dear Daniel," she typed, then paused, uncertain how to continue. The formal language of business correspondence felt wrong, but the casual tone of personal communication was foreign territory. "Thank you for reaching out. Please tell Ethan that I made it safely to my hotel and that I've been thinking about Mr. Zoom's adventures." She stopped, deleted the last sentence, then retyped it. Why was this so difficult? She negotiated million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but crafting a simple email to a man she'd known for less than 4 hours felt impossibly complex. "I hope Ethan's appointment goes well tomorrow," she continued. "I know how worried you both must be, and I'll be thinking of you. As for the Space Needle invitation, I'm not sure about my schedule yet, but I would very much like to see you both again if circumstances permit." It was a careful non-answer, the kind of diplomatic language she'd perfected for situations where commitment was premature, but interest needed to be maintained. But as soon as she sent it, Clara felt a stab of regret. Why couldn't she just say yes? Why couldn't she admit that she wanted to see them again, that the prospect of spending an afternoon with Ethan and Daniel was more appealing than any business meeting she'd ever attended? The answer, she knew, lay in years of conditioning that had taught her to prioritize professional obligations above personal desires, to view emotional connections as potential liabilities rather than sources of strength. But for the first time in her adult life, Clara found herself questioning whether that conditioning had served her well or simply built a very expensive prison. Her phone buzzed with Daniel's response arriving with surprising speed. "I understand completely about uncertain schedules," he wrote. "Business trips rarely go according to plan. But just in case, we'll be at the Space Needle around 2 p.m. tomorrow. Ethan has already decided that's when the light will be best for cloud photography. Apparently, Mr. Zoom has strong opinions about these things. No pressure at all, but the invitation stands. Thank you for caring enough to ask about the appointment. It means more than you might realize." The message was followed by a photo that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. It showed Ethan in his pajamas, fast asleep in the hotel bed, with Mr. Zoom clutched against his chest. His face, relaxed in sleep, looked even more fragile than it had on the plane, but there was something peaceful about the image that spoke to the deep security he found in his father's presence. Below the photo was a single line. "He made me promise to tell you good night from both of them, Mr. Zoom and him." Clara found herself smiling for the first time since landing in Seattle, a genuine expression of warmth that felt foreign after hours of professional pleasantries. The fact that Ethan had thought to include her in his bedtime routine, that he'd considered her important enough to warrant a good-night message, touched something deep inside her that she'd thought was permanently calcified. She saved the photo to her phone, then immediately felt foolish for the gesture. What was she becoming, a woman who collected pictures of other people's children? But she couldn't bring herself to delete it. There was something about Ethan's peaceful expression, about the trust and innocence it represented, that felt like an antidote to the cynicism that had gradually taken root in her heart. Sleep proved elusive despite her exhaustion. Clara found herself lying awake in the hotel's Egyptian cotton sheets, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the flight. She thought about Ethan's stories, about Daniel's quiet strength, about the way she'd felt when the shoe had reached for her hand during the turbulence. When had she last felt needed in a way that had nothing to do with her professional expertise? When had someone reached for her simply because they trusted her to provide comfort rather than solutions? The questions circled through her mind as Seattle's night sounds drifted up from the streets below, and traffic. and the distant laughter of people living lives that weren't constrained by quarterly reports and market projections. Clara felt a longing she couldn't quite name, a hunger for something that couldn't be satisfied by another successful acquisition or another rung on the corporate ladder. Around 3 a.m., she gave up on sleep and returned to her laptop. But instead of reviewing Henderson's contracts, she found herself researching Children's Hospital Seattle. She learned about their pediatric oncology program, their cutting-edge treatments, their family support services. She read testimonials from parents who spoke of miracles and heartbreak, in equal measure of doctors who became heroes and nurses who became family. It was a world of life and death stakes that made her business concerns seem trivial by comparison. What did market share matter when a 7-year-old was fighting for his future? What was the point of maximizing profits when families were struggling just to keep hope alive? By the time dawn began to lighten the Seattle sky, Clara had made a decision that would have been unthinkable 12 hours earlier. She reached for her phone and dialed Sarah's number, knowing her assistant would be awake and probably already working, despite the early hour. "Sarah, I need you to push the Henderson meeting back to 2 p.m., Clara said without preamble. 2 p.m.? Sarah's voice was sharp with concern. But they specifically requested 10 a.m. Moving it could signal that we're not taking the opportunity seriously. Then that's a risk we'll have to take, Clara replied, surprised by her own certainty. Tell them something urgent came up that requires my immediate attention. Offer to extend the meeting if necessary to accommodate their schedule. There was a pause and Clara could practically hear her assistant's mental calculations. Is everything all right? This isn't like you. And there it was, the acknowledgement that Clara was stepping outside her established patterns, that she was choosing something undefined over the clear path of professional advancement. It wasn't like her, and that was exactly the point. Everything's fine, Clara said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. I just need to take care of something important first. After ending the call, Clara stood again at her windows watching Seattle wake up beneath a sky that promised clear weather for cloud watching. Somewhere across the city, a little boy was probably stirring awake, maybe asking his father if it was time yet to go see the doctor who would help determine his future. And for the first time in her professional life, Clara Whitmore knew exactly where she needed to be. Clara found herself standing outside Children's Hospital, Seattle, at 8:47 a.m., clutching a cup of coffee she'd barely touched, and wondering what exactly she thought she was doing. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the hospital's modern glass facade reflected the early sunlight in brilliant fragments that hurt to look at directly. She'd never felt more out of place in her life. Her phone had been buzzing relentlessly since 7:30, Sarah trying to confirm the rescheduled Henderson meeting, her legal team with questions about contract clauses, 3 missed calls from her board chairman, who'd apparently gotten wind of the delayed negotiations. Clara had ignored them all, something that would have been unthinkable 24 hours ago. Instead, she'd spent the morning doing something she couldn't quite explain to herself, let alone to her bewildered assistant. She'd driven across Seattle in a rental car, following GPS directions, to a hospital where she had no business being drawn by a compulsion that defied every rational instinct she'd cultivated over her professional lifetime. Through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see families in various states of anxiety and hope. Parents clutching coffee cups with white knuckles, children in wheelchairs chattering to distract themselves from fear, siblings trying to make sense of medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language. It was a world of barely controlled chaos, so different from the sterile predictability of boardrooms and business hotels. Clara was about to lose her nerve and retreat to the safety of her car when she spotted them. Daniel and Ethan were sitting in a corner of the waiting area, both of them looking small and vulnerable despite Daniel's obvious attempts to project confidence for his son's benefit. Ethan was coloring in what appeared to be a medical-themed activity book, while Daniel's fingers drummed a nervous rhythm against his knee. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, Clara pushed through the hospital's automatic doors and made her way across the lobby. The sound of her heels against the polished floor seemed impossibly loud in the hushed atmosphere, and several people looked up as she passed. She felt their curious stares, this obviously out-of-place businesswoman in a pediatric hospital at 9 in the morning, but she forced herself to keep walking. "Ethan," she called softly when she was still several feet away, not wanting to startle them. The boy's head snapped up and his face transformed with a smile so radiant it nearly stopped Clara in her tracks. "You came," he exclaimed, abandoning his coloring book and launching himself toward her with the unguarded enthusiasm that only children possessed. Daniel looked up with an expression of complete shock, as if Clara were a mirage that might disappear if he looked too closely. We didn't. I mean, your email said you weren't sure about your schedule." "My schedule changed," Clara said simply, crouching down to Ethan's level as he reached her. It wasn't entirely a lie, she'd changed it herself, after all. "Did you come to help me be brave?" Ethan asked, his small hands finding hers with the same trust he'd shown on the airplane. Clara felt that familiar twist in her chest, sharper now, in the antiseptic air of a children's hospital. "I think you're already plenty brave," she said. "But I thought maybe Mr. Zoom could use some backup." Ethan giggled, reaching into his backpack to pull out the red toy airplane. "He's a little nervous about doctors," he confided, "even though I told him they're nice here." "Well, that's understandable," Clara replied seriously. "It's a big responsibility being someone's courage keeper." Daniel had risen from his chair and was watching this exchange with something approaching wonder. Clara stood to face him, suddenly uncertain again. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital, her presence here seemed even more inexplicable. What possible explanation could she give for showing up at a child's medical appointment when she should have been preparing for the most important business meeting of her quarter? "I hope you don't mind," she began, but Daniel cut her off with a shake of his head. "Mind, Clara, I can't believe you're actually here. This is—" He seemed to struggle for words, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "This is the kindest thing anyone has done for us in a very long time." Before Clara could respond, a nurse appeared at Daniel's shoulder. "Hayes, family doctor. Martinez is ready to see Ethan now." The words seemed to electrify the air around them. Daniel's face went pale, and Ethan's grip on Mr. Zoom tightened visibly. This was the moment they'd been building toward, the appointment that would determine so much about their future. "Can the nice lady come with us?" Ethan asked the nurse, looking up at Clara with hopeful eyes. The nurse glanced at Clara, taking in her business attire and obvious lack of familial connection to the patient. "Are you family?" "She's—" Ethan began, then paused, his young mind clearly working through the complexities of adult relationships. "She's our friend, a really good friend." Daniel caught Clara's eye over his son's head, silently asking permission for the designation. Clara found herself nodding, accepting a role she'd never sought, but somehow desperately wanted. "I'm sorry," the nurse said gently. "Hospital policy limits the number of people in examination rooms, but you're welcome to wait right here. We shouldn't be too long." Clara watched as Daniel gathered Ethan's things, and they followed the nurse toward the elevator bank that led to the pediatric oncology floor. Ethan turned back once to wave at her, Mr. Zoom's wing flapping in his small fist, and Clara waved back, surprised by the intensity of her anxiety as they disappeared from view. The waiting area suddenly felt enormous and empty. Clara found herself in the strange position of having nothing to do. No emails to answer, no calls to return, no meetings to prepare for. She was simply a woman sitting in a hospital lobby, waiting for news about people she'd known for less than 24 hours, but who had somehow become important to her in ways she couldn't begin to articulate. She tried to focus on her phone, scrolling through the accumulating messages from her team. The Henderson deal was important, potentially transformative for her company. But sitting here in this place where life and death decisions were made daily, where families faced challenges that made corporate negotiations seem like elaborate games, she found it impossible to care about market positioning and profit margins. Instead, she found herself observing the other families around her. A teenage girl with a bright silk scarf wrapped around her head was laughing at something her mother had whispered, her eyes sparkling with humor despite the IV port visible at her collarbone. An elderly man was reading to a small boy, who was clearly his grandson, their heads bent together over a picture book about dinosaurs. A woman about Clara's age was pacing near the windows, her phone pressed to her ear as she tried to coordinate work schedules around treatment appointments. These were people living real lives, facing real challenges that couldn't be solved with better marketing strategies or more efficient operational procedures. And yet, there was something beautiful about their resilience, their determination to find moments of joy and connection, even in the most difficult circumstances. Clara's phone rang, jolting her from her observations. The caller ID showed Richard Henderson's number, and she felt a familiar spike of professional anxiety. "Mr. Henderson," she answered, modulating her voice into its usual crisp professionalism. "Clara, I'm calling about this afternoon's delay. My team is concerned about the timeline implications. We have board meetings next week that could affect our ability to move forward if we don't have preliminary agreements in place by Friday." Clara found herself looking around the hospital lobby as Henderson spoke, taking in the quiet dramas playing out in every corner. "I understand your concerns," she said slowly, "but sometimes unexpected circumstances require flexibility." "What kind of circumstances? Is there a legal issue with the contracts, a problem with due diligence?" Clara paused, searching for an explanation that wouldn't sound completely insane. How could she tell this calculating businessman that she was sitting in a children's hospital, waiting for news about a 7-year-old she'd met on an airplane? How could she explain that this felt more important than any deal she'd ever negotiated? "Personal matter," she said finally. "Something that required my immediate attention. I assure you it won't affect our negotiations this afternoon." There was a silence on the other end of the line, and Clara could practically hear Henderson's mental calculations. In the corporate world, personal matters were code for weakness, for allowing emotion to interfere with business judgment. It was the kind of admission that could undermine confidence in a negotiation. "I see," Henderson said finally, his tone cooler now. "Well, I hope everything works out. We'll see you at 2. After ending the call, Clara stared at her phone for a long moment. She'd probably just damaged her negotiating position, possibly jeopardized the entire deal. Her board would be furious if they knew she'd put Henderson off for something this nebulous. But somehow she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. An hour passed with agonizing slowness. Clara found herself checking her watch every few minutes, wondering what was happening upstairs, whether Ethan was handling the appointment with his usual brave grace, whether Daniel was managing to hold himself together for his son's sake. She tried to read emails, tried to review contract terms, but concentration proved impossible. Finally, she saw them emerging from the elevator bank. Daniel's face was unreadable, carefully neutral in the way that suggested he was working hard to control his emotions. Ethan looked smaller somehow, tired from whatever procedures he'd endured. But both of them were walking, talking intact, and Clara felt a wave of relief so powerful it left her momentarily lightheaded. Ethan spotted her immediately and broke into a run, Mr. Zoom flying behind him like a tiny red comet. "Clara, we saw Dr. Martinez, and she was really nice, and she said I was the bravest patient she'd seen all week." Clara caught him in another spontaneous hug, marveling again at how natural this felt, despite being completely outside her normal experience. "Of course you were brave," she said. "Mr. Zoom told me you would be. She wants to see me again in 2 weeks." Ethan continued, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement to share his news. "And she said I might get to ring the bell if the medicine keeps working." Clara looked over Ethan's head at Daniel, searching his face for clues about what ringing the bell might mean. What "if the medicine keeps working" implied about Ethan's condition. Daniel's expression was complex relief mixed with ongoing worry, hope, tempered by the hard-won knowledge that medical progress was never guaranteed. "The treatment is working," he said, simply answering the question Clara hadn't known how to ask. "It's not over, won't be over for a long time, but it's working." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Clara could only begin to grasp. This wasn't a simple success story, wasn't a clean resolution to a medical crisis. It was the messy, complicated reality of chronic illness progress, measured in small victories, hope balanced against uncertainty life lived in the spaces between appointments and test results. "That's wonderful news," Clara said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. "Dr. Martinez said we should celebrate," Ethan announced. "She said celebrating good news is almost as important as medicine." Daniel smiled, the first truly relaxed expression Clara had seen from him. "She did say that, didn't she? What kind of celebration did you have in mind, buddy?" "The Space Needle," Ethan declared without hesitation. "And maybe ice cream, and definitely showing Clara all the best clouds in Seattle." Clara glanced at her watch, 11:30 a.m. She had just over 2 hours before the Henderson meeting, before she had to transform back into the sharp-edged executive who prioritized deals over people. But looking at Ethan's hopeful face, at Daniel's cautious gratitude, she knew there was only one possible response. "I can't think of anything I'd rather do," she said. The Space Needle was busier than Clara had expected for a Thursday morning filled with tourists and school groups and locals who never tired of their city's most famous landmark. But Ethan navigated the crowds with the confidence of someone who had specific plans and the determination to execute them. "The best spot for cloud watching is on the north side," he explained seriously as they rode the elevator to the observation deck. "Daddy and I checked the weather reports, and the wind is coming from the right direction for really good formations." Clara found herself charmed by his methodical approach to sightseeing. In her world, efficiency was prized above all else, but Ethan's version of efficiency included factors like optimal lighting for cloud photography and the aesthetic appeal of different viewing angles. "There," Ethan exclaimed as they emerged onto the observation deck, pointing toward a cluster of cumulus clouds drifting lazily across Elliott Bay. "Those are definitely 12s, maybe even 13s. Daniel laughed, ruffling his son's hair. 13, that's a new record." "Well, they're extra fluffy today," Ethan said matter-of-factly. "And look how they're kind of golden around the edges. Mr. Zoom says that means they're particularly special clouds." Clara followed Ethan's gaze, trying to see the formations through his eyes. She'd never paid much attention to clouds. Before, they were simply weather patterns, potential flight delays, atmospheric conditions that affected nothing more important than whether she needed an umbrella. But viewed through a 7-year-old's lens of wonder, they became something altogether different. Art forms, perhaps. temporary sculptures painted across an ever-changing canvas. "Mr. Zoom has excellent taste in clouds," she said seriously. For the next hour, Clara found herself experiencing Seattle from a completely new perspective. Through Ethan's commentary, the city became a collection of stories rather than simply a business destination. He pointed out the building where his father had once worked on a restoration project, the park where they'd had their best picnic ever, the ferry dock, where they'd watched boats come and go while waiting for a medical appointment that had ultimately delivered good news. "See that blue building over there?" Ethan said, pressing his face against the observation deck's glass. "That's where my friend Tommy lives. He's in my class at school, but he doesn't know about my being sick because Daddy says I don't have to tell people unless I want to." Clara glanced at Daniel, who was watching his son with an expression of such profound love and pride that it made her chest ache. "That must be hard sometimes," she said quietly, "deciding what to share." "It is," Daniel replied. "But Ethan gets to choose how much of his story to tell. I never want him to feel like his illness defines him, or like he has to be the sick kid in every situation." It was such a thoughtful approach to an impossible situation, Clara realized. Most people, herself included, would probably either hide the illness completely or let it dominate every interaction. But Daniel had somehow found a middle path that preserved his son's agency while still acknowledging their reality. "What about you?" she found herself asking. "Do you get to choose how much of the story to tell?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking out over the city spread below them. "It's different for parents," he said finally. "Your kid's illness becomes part of everything: work schedules, social plans, financial decisions. But I try not to let it become my whole identity either. I'm Ethan's dad first, and everything else is just logistics." The simple statement contained volumes about sacrifice and love, and the ways people reorganized their entire lives around what mattered most. Clara thought about her own priorities, her carefully structured existence, where every decision was filtered through considerations of professional advancement and market positioning. When had she last made a choice based purely on love? "Can I take a picture of you and Mr. Zoom with the city in the background?" she asked Ethan, pulling out her phone. "For the Airplane Family album." Ethan's face lit up with delight, and he immediately began posing Mr. Zoom in various dramatic positions against the Seattle skyline. Clara found herself laughing, actually laughing, as the boy created increasingly elaborate scenarios for his toy airplane's photo shoot. "Now one of all of us," Ethan declared, running over to position Clara and Daniel on either side of him. "Daddy, you hold Mr. Zoom up high so he can see everything." Daniel obliged, lifting the red airplane above their heads, while Ethan beamed between them. Clara triggered the camera's timer function, and they all leaned together, creating an impromptu family portrait that would have been unimaginable to her just days before. Looking at the resulting photo, Clara was struck by how natural they appeared together, how right it felt to be standing between this father and son, with the city of Seattle stretching endlessly behind them. She looked genuinely happy, and the image relaxed in a way she couldn't remember being in any professional context. "Can you send that to me?" Daniel asked, and Clara realized he'd been watching her study the photo. "Of course," she replied, then hesitated. "Actually, could I? Would it be all right if I kept a copy too?" Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a warmth that went beyond simple gratitude. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like that very much." They were interrupted by Ethan's excited cry from the other side of the observation deck. Look, airplane families!" Clara and Daniel hurried over to where he was pointing, following his gaze toward the sky above Elliott Bay. 3 small planes were flying in formation, not military aircraft, but what appeared to be recreational pilots practicing synchronized maneuvers. They moved together with graceful precision, sometimes separating to create complex patterns before rejoining in tight formation. "It's just like Mr. Zoom's family," Ethan exclaimed, clutching his toy airplane to his chest. "They're flying together so nobody gets lonely." Clara watched the display with growing amazement, not at the aerial acrobatics themselves, but at Ethan's ability to find magic in the most ordinary moments. How many people walked through life missing these small wonders because they were too focused on their destinations to notice the journey? "Make a wish," Daniel said softly, putting his arm around his son's shoulders. "Airplane families are supposed to be good luck." Ethan closed his eyes tightly, his lips moving in silent concentration. Clara found herself closing her own eyes, though she couldn't remember the last time she'd made a wish on anything. What did successful CEOs wish for when they already had everything they'd thought they wanted? But as she stood there with the Seattle wind ruffling her carefully styled hair and the sound of Ethan's quiet breathing beside her, Clara found herself wishing for something she couldn't quite name. Not success or recognition or financial growth, but something more fundamental. Something that felt like coming home to a place she'd never been before. When she opened her eyes, she found Daniel watching her with an expression of gentle curiosity. "What did you wish for?" he asked quietly, while Ethan was distracted by the continuing aerial display. Clara hesitated, unsure how to put her nebulous longings into words. "I'm not sure," she said finally. "I think I wished for this. For more moments like this." "Moments like what?" "Moments when everything feels—" She struggled to find the right words. "Real, connected, important in ways that have nothing to do with profit margins or strategic positioning." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "It's easy to lose track of that, isn't it? What actually matters?" "I don't think I ever knew what actually mattered," Clara admitted. "I've been so focused on building something, a career, a reputation, a legacy, that I forgot to build a life." The words hung between them, more honest than Clara had intended to be. She'd just confessed to a virtual stranger that her existence felt hollow, that despite all her professional achievements, she was fundamentally lost. It should have been embarrassing, this admission of emotional bankruptcy. Instead, it felt like relief. "It's not too late," Daniel said simply. "Life isn't a company you acquire and optimize. It's something you live day by day, choice by choice." Before Clara could respond, Ethan came running back to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Did you see how they made a heart shape in the sky? Mr. Zoom says that's a special sign." "A sign of what?" Clara asked, crouching down to his level. "That today is going to be a really, really good day," Ethan said confidently. "And that good things are coming for all of us." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, a response that would have mortified her in any professional context, but felt entirely appropriate here. This child facing medical uncertainty, with more grace than most adults could muster, was offering hope to the world around him. His faith in the goodness of life was so pure, so unshakable, that it made Clara's cynicism seem not just unnecessary, but actively harmful. "I think Mr. Zoom is very wise," she said, her voice slightly husky. "He is," Ethan agreed solemnly. "He says the best adventures are the ones you don't plan for, like meeting you on the airplane." The innocent observation hit Clara like a physical blow, reminding her of everything she'd forgotten about spontaneity and openness to possibility. When had she last allowed herself an unplanned adventure? When had she last let serendipity guide her choices instead of careful, strategic thinking? Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Henderson Group asking for confirmation of 2 p.m. meeting. Should I confirm? Clara stared at the message, reality intruding on the magical bubble that had surrounded the morning. In less than 2 hours, she would need to transform back into the person she'd been before the airplane, before Ethan's stories and Daniel's quiet strength had shown her different ways of existing in the world. But as she looked at this father and son, who had somehow become important to her in the space of a single morning, Clara realized she wasn't ready to let go of this version of herself. Not yet. "There's something I need to tell you both," she said, surprising herself with the decision even as she made it. Daniel and Ethan looked at her expectantly, and Clara felt a moment of panic. What was she about to do? What was she about to risk? "I have a very important business meeting this afternoon," she began carefully. "The kind of meeting that could change my company's future that I've been working toward for months." Ethan's face fell slightly, clearly anticipating that she was about to leave them. "But," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger, "I've decided that some things are more important than business meetings, and spending the afternoon with the two of you exploring Seattle rating clouds, maybe getting that ice cream Dr. Taton Martinez recommended that feels like the most important thing I could possibly do today." The words were out before she could reconsider them, before she could calculate the professional risks or consider the potential consequences. She'd just blown off the biggest deal of her quarter to spend the afternoon playing tourist with a 7-year-old and his father. Her board would be apoplectic. Her shareholders would question her judgment. Her carefully constructed career trajectory would be thrown into uncertainty. And for the first time in her adult life, Clara Whitmore discovered she didn't care. Ethan's reaction was immediate and explosive, a whoop of joy that echoed across the observation deck and drew amused glances from other tourists. He launched himself at Clara with such enthusiasm that she had to take a step back to keep from being knocked over, his small arms wrapping around her waist with fierce gratitude. "Really, really, really?" he asked, his voice muffled against her jacket. "You're going to stay with us for the whole afternoon?" "Really, really?" Clara confirmed, feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by what she'd just committed to. Her phone was already buzzing again, undoubtedly Sarah trying to confirm the Henderson meeting, but she switched it to silent without looking at the screen. Daniel's expression was harder to read. He was studying her face with an intensity that made Clara feel exposed, as if he were trying to decipher the motivations behind her impulsive decision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of concern beneath the obvious gratitude. "Clara, that's incredibly generous, but are you sure? If this meeting is as important as you say—" "It is important," Clara interrupted, then paused, searching for words to explain what she barely understood herself. "Or at least I thought it was. But sitting here with you both watching Ethan rate clouds and make wishes on airplane formations, I'm starting to think I've been confusing busy with important for a very long time." Daniel's expression softened, and something passed between them that felt like recognition, the acknowledgement of two people who had both made sacrifices for what they believed mattered, but who were now questioning whether those sacrifices had been worth it. "Well then," he said quietly, "I guess we'd better make this the best afternoon Seattle has ever seen." The next few hours unfolded like a dream sequence from a life Clara had never dared to imagine for herself. They rode the monorail through downtown Seattle, with Ethan providing enthusiastic commentary about every building and landmark they passed. His knowledge of the city was encyclopedic, accumulated through countless medical visits that had somehow been transformed into adventures through his irrepressible curiosity and Daniel's determination to find joy even in difficult circumstances. "That's where Daddy and I saw the biggest seagull in the world," Ethan announced, pointing to Pike Place Market as they approached. "It stole a whole sandwich right out of a lady's hands, but she just laughed and bought another one." The biggest seagull in the world? Clara asked, raising an eyebrow at Daniel. Well, it was definitely the most confident seagull in the world, Daniel replied with a grin. Size is relative when you're dealing with that level of audacity. Clara found herself laughing, really laughing at their easy banter. When was the last time she'd engaged in conversation that wasn't loaded with subtext and strategic considerations? When had she last talked to people who said exactly what they meant? Without calculating the potential advantages of their words, Pike Place Market was a sensory assault that would normally have overwhelmed Clara's need for order and predictability. The crowds, the noise, the chaos of vendors calling out their wares and tourists jostling for position. It should have triggered every stress response she'd developed during years of high-pressure business environments. Instead, she found herself swept along by Ethan's infectious enthusiasm as he navigated the market with the expertise of a seasoned guide. "The fish throwers are over here," he announced, tugging Clara by the hand toward the famous fish market. "But you have to be careful because sometimes they miss, and the fish goes flying into the crowd." "Has that ever happened to you?" Clara asked, allowing herself to be pulled along. "Once," Ethan said solemnly. "A salmon bonked me right on the head. But Daddy caught it before it hit the ground, so we got to keep it for dinner." Daniel's cheeks reddened slightly. "It was more of a gentle tap than a bonk," he clarified. "And the vendor insisted we take the fish home after Ethan charmed everyone within a 50-foot radius with his reaction." "What did you do?" Clara asked Ethan. "I thanked the fish for choosing me," Ethan replied matter-of-factly. "Daddy says it's important to be polite even to fish." The simple statement encapsulated everything Clara was beginning to understand about this remarkable father-son duo. They faced life's unexpected challenges, even flying fish with grace humor and an unshakable commitment to finding the positive in every situation. It was a worldview so fundamentally different from her own cynical pragmatism that it felt revolutionary. They spent an hour wandering through the market, sampling cheese and fruit, watching street performers, and listening to Ethan's running commentary on everything from the optimal technique for selecting apples to the probable life histories of the various musicians they encountered. Clara found herself seeing the familiar tourist destination through completely new eyes, transformed from a crowded commercial space into a theater of human connection and simple pleasures. "Ice cream time," Ethan announced as they emerged from the market into the afternoon sunshine. "Dr. Martinez said celebrating was important, and ice cream is definitely celebration food." "What's your favorite flavor?" Clara asked as they walked toward a nearby gelato shop that Ethan had somehow identified from 3 blocks away. "Chocolate," Ethan said without hesitation. "But not just any chocolate. It has to be the kind that's so dark it's almost purple, and it has to have chunks of real chocolate in it, not just chocolate flavor." "That's very specific," Clara observed. "Good things are worth being specific about," Ethan replied with the wisdom of someone far older than 7. Daniel caught Clara's eye over his son's head and smiled. "He gets that from his mother," he said quietly. "She always said life was too short for mediocre chocolate." It was the first time Daniel had mentioned Ethan's mother, and Clara felt a flutter of something that might have been jealousy mixed with curiosity. What kind of woman had captured Daniel's heart? What had happened to break up their family? And why did the thought of Daniel loving someone else create such an unexpected ache in her chest, but before she could formulate any of the questions crowding her mind? Ethan had reached the gelato shop and was pressing his face against the display case with the intense concentration of a sommelier evaluating a vintage wine. "That one," he declared, pointing to a dark chocolate gelato that looked almost black in the fluorescent lighting. "And maybe just a tiny bit of the vanilla bean, too, for contrast." Clara found herself charmed by his sophisticated palate and serious approach to flavor combinations. She ordered lavender honey, something she never would have chosen in her normal life, but that seemed appropriate for this afternoon of new experiences. Daniel opted for salted caramel, and they found themselves sitting on a bench outside the shop, watching Seattle's afternoon foot traffic while savoring their frozen treats. "This is probably the best gelato I've ever had," Clara said, surprised by how much she meant it. "It's because you're eating it in good company," Ethan observed sagely, chocolate already smeared across his chin. "Food always tastes better when you're with people you like." "Is that another one of your daddy's sayings?" Clara asked. "No, that's one of mine," Ethan replied proudly. "I figured it out all by myself when I was 5 and had to eat hospital food for a whole week. But then Daddy brought me a peanut butter sandwich from home. And even though hospital sandwiches and home sandwiches are made with the same ingredients, the home one tasted completely different." Clara felt that familiar twist in her chest as she glimpsed another piece of Ethan's medical journey. How many weeks had this child spent in hospitals? How many times had he faced procedures and treatments that would terrify adults, and yet here he was, turning those experiences into life lessons about the importance of love and connection in making even the most ordinary moments special. "You're a very wise person, Ethan," she said seriously. "Thank you," Ethan replied, then tilted his head thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you lonely?" The question hit Clara like a physical blow, so direct and unexpected that she nearly choked on her gelato. She glanced at Daniel, who looked mortified by his son's bluntness, but didn't intervene. Clearly, Ethan was allowed to ask the questions that occurred to him even when they ventured into uncomfortable territory. Clara began, then stopped. Her first instinct was to deflect, to give the polished non-answer she'd perfected for personal questions in professional contexts. But something about Ethan's earnest expression, about the complete absence of judgment in his voice, made her want to tell the truth. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I am lonely. I didn't realize how lonely until I met you and your daddy on the airplane." Ethan nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "I thought so. You have the same look that Daddy gets sometimes when he thinks I'm not watching." Daniel's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Ethan continued with the relentless honesty of childhood. "It's okay to be lonely," he said. "Everyone gets lonely sometimes, but the good news is that lonely doesn't have to be forever. Sometimes people find each other when they need it most." Clara felt tears threatening again, a response that was becoming disturbingly frequent in this child's presence. How had a 7-year-old developed such profound emotional intelligence? How did he see through the careful facades that adults spent years constructing? "How did you get so smart?" she asked, her voice slightly unsteady. "I think it's because I've had to think about important things more than most kids," Ethan replied matter-of-factly. "When you might not have as much time as other people, you learn to pay attention to what really matters." The casual reference to his mortality was delivered with such matter-of-fact acceptance that it took Clara a moment to process the full weight of what he'd said. This child understood in ways that most adults never had to, that life was fragile and finite. And instead of making him bitter or afraid that knowledge had somehow made him more generous, more perceptive, more determined to create meaning and connection wherever he found it. Daniel's jaw was tight with emotion, and Clara could see him struggling to maintain composure. How did he bear it? This daily awareness that his son carried such heavy wisdom, that Ethan's childhood had been shaped by realities no child should have to face. "Well," Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I think I'm very lucky to have met such a wise teacher." "We're all lucky," Ethan said simply. "That's what I wished for when we saw the airplane families, that we'd all be lucky together." The afternoon continued in a haze of simple pleasures that felt miraculous to Clara's work-conditioned mind. They rode the ferry to Bainbridge Island, where Ethan collected smooth stones and declared each one a worry stone, with special powers to absorb anxiety. They visited the Seattle Aquarium, where Ethan's encyclopedic knowledge of marine life rivaled that of the volunteer docents. They walked through Olympic Sculpture Park, where Ethan created elaborate stories about the artist's intentions that were probably more interesting than the actual inspiration behind the pieces. Throughout it all, Clara found herself marveling at the ease with which she'd slipped into this improvised family unit. She and Daniel developed an unspoken rhythm of shared responsibility, one of them engaging Ethan in conversation, while the other handled practical details, both of them attuned to the boy's energy levels and need for periodic rest breaks. It felt natural in a way that nothing in Clara's meticulously planned life had ever felt natural. But it was during a quiet moment on the ferry ride back to downtown Seattle that the afternoon took on a deeper significance. Ethan had fallen asleep against Daniel's shoulder, exhausted by the day's adventures, and Clara found herself sitting across from them studying the peaceful tableau they created. "He's had a good day," Daniel said quietly, his hand stroking his son's hair with unconscious tenderness. "The best," Clara agreed. "He's an extraordinary child, Daniel. You've done something amazing with him." Daniel's smile was sad around the edges. "I've tried to give him as normal a childhood as possible under the circumstances. But days like today, when he gets to just be a kid experiencing the world without medical appointments and treatment schedules hanging over everything, those are the days I treasure most." Clara felt a stab of something that might have been grief for all the normal childhood experiences that Ethan had missed, for all the worry that Daniel carried as a single parent, navigating an impossible situation. But beneath the sadness was something else, a fierce admiration for the way they'd both chosen to face their challenges with grace and determination. "Can I ask?" she began hesitantly, then stopped, unsure whether she had the right to probe into such personal territory. "About his mother," Daniel asked, correctly interpreting her unfinished question. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the Seattle skyline approaching through the ferry's windows. "Sarah died when Ethan was 3, he said finally. "Cancer. Aggressive, fast-moving. She went from perfectly healthy to gone in 6 months." The simple statement contained volumes of pain that Clara could only begin to imagine. She wanted to offer condolences, to say something meaningful about loss and resilience, but every response that occurred to her seemed inadequate. "I'm so sorry," she said finally, because it was true, even if it wasn't enough. "The hardest part was explaining it to Ethan," Daniel continued. "How do you tell a 3-year-old that mommy isn't coming home? How do you help them understand something that you can barely understand yourself?" Clara shook her head, unable to fathom the magnitude of such a conversation. "But you know what he said, when I finally found the words." Daniel's voice carried a note of wonder even after all these years. He said, "Is mommy going to watch me from the clouds now?" And when I said yes, he said, "Good, because clouds go everywhere, so she'll never miss anything important." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, now no longer caring about maintaining professional composure. The image of a 3-year-old processing the ultimate loss with such profound acceptance and even comfort was almost too beautiful to bear. "And then," Daniel continued, "about a year later, when we found out about Ethan's own diagnosis, he told me not to worry, because mommy was probably arranging the best doctors from her cloud office." "His diagnosis?" Clara repeated the words, feeling strange in her mouth. She'd understood that Ethan was facing medical challenges, but the specifics had remained abstract. Now looking at this sleeping child, who had spent the afternoon sharing his wisdom and wonder, with such generosity, the reality of his illness felt personal, in a way that was almost overwhelming. Leukemia, Daniel said simply. Diagnosed when he was 5. We're 2 years into treatment now, and the prognosis is good, excellent, actually. But it's been... He trailed off, searching for words to describe an experience that was clearly beyond conventional language. Terrifying, Clara suggested. Beyond terrifying, Daniel agreed. But also clarifying in strange ways. When you're faced with the possibility of losing everything that matters, you realize very quickly what actually does matter. And everything else, the career pressures, the social expectations, the need to keep up appearances, it all just falls away. Clara nodded, thinking about her own afternoon of abandoned responsibilities and professional obligations. In the space of a few hours, she'd experienced something similar, a stripping away of artificial priorities to reveal what felt truly important. But Daniel had been living with that clarity for years, making decisions daily based on love rather than ambition. How do you do it? She asked. How do you stay strong for him when you must be terrified every single day? Daniel looked down at his sleeping son, his expression infinitely tender. Because he needs me to be strong. Because giving in to the fear wouldn't help him, wouldn't change anything except to make his world scarier than it already is. And because... He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. Because he's taught me that strength isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing love anyway. The ferry was approaching the dock now, and other passengers were beginning to gather their belongings and prepare for disembarkation. But Clara felt frozen in place, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Daniel had shared with her, and by her own response to his story. She'd built her entire adult life around the accumulation of power and success, believing that control and achievement would somehow insulate her from life's inevitable uncertainties. But here was a man who had faced the ultimate uncertainty, the potential loss of his child, and had emerged not bitter or broken, but somehow more whole, more grounded in what actually mattered. Daniel, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for letting me be part of today, for letting me see this, all of this. He looked at her with that same gentle intensity she'd noticed on the airplane, as if he were seeing something in her that she was only beginning to recognize in herself. Thank you for choosing to stay, he replied. For choosing us over your meeting. I know what that decision probably cost you. Clara thought about the Henderson deal, about the inevitable consequences of blowing off such an important negotiation. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the afternoon, calls and texts she'd ignored in favor of gelato and ferry rides and conversations about airplane families. Tomorrow she would have to face the fallout from her choices. There would be angry board members, disappointed investors, possibly damaged relationships that had taken years to build. But looking at Daniel and Ethan, at this accidental family she'd somehow become part of, Clara realized she didn't regret a single moment of the afternoon. If anything, she regretted all the years she'd spent making the opposite choice, prioritizing deals over people, strategies over relationships, professional advancement over human connection. It didn't cost me anything, she said finally. It gave me everything. Ethan stirred against his father's shoulder, blinking sleepily, as the ferry's engines changed pitch in preparation for docking. Are we back already? He asked, his voice thick with sleep. We are, buddy, Daniel replied. Did you have good dreams? I dreamed about airplane families, Ethan said, sitting up and looking around with the rapid alertness that only children possessed. and about clouds that tasted like ice cream, and about— He paused, looking at Clara with sudden shyness. About having a really big family instead of just a little one. The innocent words hit Clara like a physical blow, revealing depths of longing she hadn't recognized in the boy's cheerful demeanor. Of course, he dreamed about larger families. What child who had lost his mother wouldn't crave the security and love that came with more people to count on? "That sounds like a beautiful dream," Clara said carefully. "It was," Ethan agreed. "And the best part was that in the dream, nobody was sick, and nobody was lonely, and nobody had to worry about anything except which flavor of ice cream clouds to eat next." Daniel's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and Clara felt her own throat constrict with emotion. This child's capacity for hope, his ability to imagine a world free from the medical uncertainties that dominated his reality, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. As they disembarked from the ferry and walked back into the bustle of downtown Seattle, Clara found herself reluctant for the afternoon to end. She'd entered a different world during these few hours, a world where time was measured in shared experiences, rather than billable hours, where success was defined by laughter and connection, rather than market share and profit margins. But reality was waiting for her in the form of increasingly urgent messages from her team. Her phone showed 17 missed calls, 34 text messages, and an inbox full of emails with subject lines that ranged from concerned to frantic. The business world didn't pause for personal revelations or accidental families. It demanded attention, commitment, and the kind of single-minded focus that had made her successful, but had also, she was beginning to realize, made her profoundly unhappy. "I should probably—" she began, gesturing toward her phone. "Of course," Daniel said, understanding immediately. "We've kept you from your responsibilities long enough." But as Clara looked at her phone's screen, scrolling through the accumulated messages from her professional life, she felt a strange disconnection from the urgency that surrounded her. The Henderson deal, which had seemed so crucial that morning, now felt abstract and distant. The board's concerns about quarterly projections seemed trivial compared to Ethan's brave smile as he faced medical uncertainty. The strategic advantages of various acquisition scenarios paled beside the simple joy of watching a 7-year-old rate clouds and tell stories about airplane families. "Actually," she heard herself saying, "the responsibilities can wait a little longer. Would you like to get dinner? I know this probably sounds strange, but I'm not quite ready to go back to being the person I was this morning." Ethan's face lit up with delight, but Daniel looked uncertain. "Clara, you've already given us so much of your time, and those messages look pretty urgent." "They always look urgent," Clara replied, surprised by her own certainty. "But urgent isn't the same as important. And right now, this being here with you both, this feels like the most important thing I've done in years." As they walked through Seattle's evening streets, Clara felt as though she were living in a parallel universe where different rules applied, where connection mattered more than competition, and where love was more valuable than leverage. It was a universe she wanted to inhabit permanently, but she wasn't sure such a transformation was possible for someone who had spent so many years building walls around her heart. The restaurant Ethan chose was nothing like the places Clara normally frequented for business dinners, a casual family establishment with checkered tablecloths and crayons provided for young diners. But as she sat across from Daniel and Ethan, watching them share easy conversation about everything from optimal pizza toppings to the migration patterns of Seattle's urban wildlife, Clara realized she'd never enjoyed a meal more. And somewhere between the second slice of pizza and Ethan's detailed explanation of why anchovies were ocean vegetables, Clara began to understand that she was falling in love not just with Daniel's quiet strength or Ethan's irrepressible spirit, but with the version of herself she became in their presence. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly seen, truly valued for something beyond her professional accomplishments. But love, she was learning, was more complicated than any business deal she'd ever negotiated. And the choices ahead of her would require a kind of courage she'd never needed in any boardroom. The evening air carried a hint of autumn as they walked back toward their hotels. After dinner, Ethan skipping between Clara and Daniel with the boundless energy that seemed to emerge whenever he was truly happy. The Seattle streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and Clara found herself memorizing every detail of the moment, the sound of Ethan's laughter echoing off the buildings, the warmth of Daniel's presence beside her, the way the city seemed to sparkle with possibility in the gathering dusk. But reality was an insistent companion, manifesting in the weight of her phone in her pocket, and the knowledge that her professional life was unraveling with every hour she spent in this alternate universe of pizza dinners and airplane stories. The messages had stopped coming with quite such urgency, which Clara recognized as an ominous sign. In the corporate world, silence often meant that decisions were being made without you. "I should probably check these messages," she said reluctantly as they paused at a crosswalk, "just to see how much damage I've done." Daniel nodded understandingly, but Ethan looked up at her with concern. "Are you in trouble because you stayed with us?" he asked, his voice small. Clara crouched down to his level, struck by how quickly this child had learned to read the undercurrents of adult anxiety. "Not trouble exactly," she said carefully. "But sometimes when grown-ups make unexpected choices, other grown-ups get confused and worried. Like when I decided to paint the living room wall to make it prettier, and Daddy got confused about why I thought purple polka dots were a good idea," Ethan asked. Despite everything, Clara found herself smiling. "Something like that, yes." "But Daddy wasn't really mad," Ethan continued. "He was just surprised. And then he helped me turn the polka dots into a rainbow, and it looked even better than I thought it would." The innocent story carried more wisdom than most business school case studies, Clara realized. Sometimes the best outcomes emerged from unexpected choices, from the willingness to color outside the carefully drawn lines of conventional wisdom. Her phone rang before she could respond to Ethan's story, and Clara saw Sarah's number on the screen. There was no avoiding this conversation any longer. "Sarah?" she answered, stepping slightly away from Daniel and Ethan to spare them the inevitable awkwardness. "Clara, thank God." Her assistant's voice was tight with stress. "Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours. The Henderson Group is furious. They're talking about pulling out of negotiations entirely." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of professional consequences settling on her shoulders, like a familiar but unwelcome coat. What exactly did they say? That if you couldn't be bothered to show up for a meeting you'd requested, then perhaps Whitmore Industries wasn't the kind of reliable partner they were looking for. Richard Henderson specifically asked whether you were having some kind of personal crisis that might affect your judgment going forward. The words stung not because they were unfair, but because they weren't entirely wrong. She was having a personal crisis, though not the kind Henderson would understand. She was discovering that the life she'd built was hollow at its core, that success without connection was just elaborate loneliness, that all her achievements meant nothing if she had no one to share them with who truly mattered. "And the board?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer would be unpleasant. "Emergency meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. The board wants a full explanation of what happened and assurance that it won't happen again. Clara, I have to ask, is everything okay? This isn't like you at all." Clara looked over at Daniel and Ethan, who were examining something in a shop window, with the intense concentration that seemed to characterize all their interactions with the world. Ethan was pointing at what appeared to be a display of model airplanes, and Daniel was listening to his son's commentary with the patient attention he brought to everything the boy said. "No," Clara said slowly. "It's not like me at all, and I'm starting to think that might be the point." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Clara, what does that mean? Are you saying you did this intentionally, that you deliberately sabotaged one of the biggest deals of the year?" The accusation hung in the air between them, and Clara realized that from any conventional perspective, that's exactly what she'd done. She'd chosen personal fulfillment over professional obligation, emotional connection over strategic advantage. By every metric that had guided her adult life, she'd made the wrong choice. But as she watched Ethan lift Daniel's hand to point at something in the display, as she saw the unguarded love that passed between father and son, in that simple gesture, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the only choice that mattered. "I'll call Henderson myself," she said finally. "I'll try to salvage what I can of the relationship, and I'll be on the first flight back to Boston tomorrow to face whatever consequences the board decides are appropriate." "Okay," Sarah said, relief evident in her voice. "Okay, that's good. I'll send you Henderson's direct number and brief you on..." "Sarah," Clara interrupted gently. "Thank you for everything. You've been an incredible assistant and an even better friend than I deserved. But I need to go now." After ending the call, Clara stood for a moment in the Seattle evening, feeling the full weight of the professional bridge she'd just burned. Tomorrow she would face a board of directors who would question her judgment, her commitment, and her fitness to lead the company she'd spent years building. She might lose her position, her reputation, her carefully constructed identity as a successful CEO. But tonight, she was standing on a sidewalk with two people who had shown her what it meant to live with authenticity and courage, and that felt like the most valuable education she'd ever received. "Bad news?" Daniel asked as she rejoined them, his voice carefully neutral. "Complicated news," Clara replied. "But not unexpected. I knew there would be consequences for choosing to spend the day with you instead of in a conference room." Ethan looked up at her with those serious dark eyes that seemed to see too much. "Are you sorry you chose us?" The question was so direct, so vulnerable, that Clara felt her heart clench. This child, who had already faced more uncertainty than most adults, was now worried that his friendship had caused problems for someone he cared about. "No," she said, kneeling down to meet his gaze directly. "I'm not sorry at all. Today has been one of the best days of my entire life. Whatever happens tomorrow, nothing can change that." Ethan's smile was radiant, but Daniel's expression remained troubled. "Clara, if this is going to cause serious problems for you..." "It already has caused serious problems," Clara interrupted. "But the problems existed long before I met you. I've just been too busy achieving success to notice how empty it was making me." They walked the remaining blocks to the hotel district in thoughtful silence, each lost in their own contemplations. Clara found herself trying to memorize every detail of the evening, the way the streetlights painted golden circles on the pavement, the distant sound of music from a jazz club, the comfortable rhythm of walking beside people who accepted her completely, without expecting anything in return. When they reached the corner where their paths would diverge, Clara to her luxury suite, Daniel and Ethan to their modest accommodation, none of them seemed eager to say goodbye. "What time is your flight tomorrow?" Daniel asked. 7:30, Clara replied. "I should probably be at the airport by 5:30, which means leaving the hotel around 4:30. "That's really early," Ethan observed. "Will you be too tired to think about good things on the airplane?" Clara smiled at his concern for her in-flight experience. I think I'll have plenty of good things to think about. Today gave me enough good memories to last a very long flight. Will you think about us? Ethan asked, with the directness that had become familiar. Every day, Clara replied, surprised by how much she meant it. I'll think about cloud families and airplane adventures and the wisest 7-year-old I've ever met. Ethan beamed, then suddenly looked thoughtful. Can I give you something to remember today? Before Clara could respond, he was digging through his backpack with serious concentration. After a moment, he pulled out Mr. Zoom, holding the red toy airplane carefully in both hands. Ethan, no, Daniel said immediately. You can't give Clara Mr. Zoom. He's been with you through everything. That's exactly why I want to give him to her, Ethan replied with the unshakable logic of childhood. Mr. Zoom is the bravest airplane in the world, and Clara needs to be brave tomorrow when she talks to the angry business people. He'll help her remember that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. Clara felt tears threatening again as she looked at the worn toy airplane that had been Ethan's companion through medical procedures and uncertain nights through treatments and recoveries, and all the small fears that came with childhood illness. The idea of accepting such a precious gift felt both overwhelming and deeply meaningful. Ethan, I can't take your courage keeper, she said softly. You need him. I'll always need him, Ethan agreed. But right now you need him more. And Mr. Zoom told me that's what friends do. They share their courage when someone else is running low. Daniel's eyes were bright with emotion as he watched his son make this generous gesture. Buddy, are you absolutely sure Mr. Zoom has been your special friend for so long? He'll still be my special friend, Ethan said matter-of-factly. But now he'll be Clara's special friend too. And maybe when she's done being brave, she can bring him back and tell me about all the adventures they had together. And the innocent words carried the implicit assumption that Clara would return, that this wasn't goodbye, but simply, see you later. The faith behind that assumption, Ethan's unshakable belief that people who mattered to each other found ways to stay connected, was both humbling and terrifying. Clara accepted the toy airplane with trembling hands, feeling the weight of years of love and trust that had worn its paint smooth in places. I promise to take very good care of him, she said solemnly, and to tell him stories about cloud formations and proper ice cream selection. And about brave choices, Ethan added. Mr. Zoom likes stories about people who choose to be brave even when it's scary. As they finally said their goodbyes with promises to stay in touch and tentative plans for future visits, Clara found herself walking back to her hotel with Mr. Zoom clutched carefully in her hand. The toy airplane felt warm against her palm, imbued with the love and courage of a remarkable child who faced each day with grace that put most adults to shame. Her suite felt even more oppressive when she returned the luxury appointments, seeming almost mocking after an evening of genuine human connection. Clara placed Mr. Zoom carefully on the bedside table, where his chipped red paint caught the lamplight, like a small beacon of hope in the sterile room. She spent the rest of the evening making the phone calls she couldn't avoid any longer. Henderson was polite but cold, making it clear that Whitmore Industries had damaged its reputation as a reliable partner. Her board chairman was less polite, demanding explanations that Clara found impossible to provide in terms he would understand. How could she explain that she'd discovered something more valuable than market share during a conversation about airplane families? How could she justify abandoning a crucial negotiation to eat gelato with a 7-year-old by midnight? Clara had done what damage control she could, but she knew that tomorrow's board meeting would be a reckoning. Her position as CEO was almost certainly in jeopardy, and with it the identity she'd spent years constructing around professional achievement and strategic thinking. But as she lay in the Egyptian cotton sheets looking at Mr. Zoom's silhouette against the Seattle skyline, Clara realized she felt more at peace than she had in years. For the first time in her adult life, she'd made choices based on love rather than logic, on connection rather than calculation. The consequences might be severe, but the experience had been transformative. She dreamed that night of airplane families flying in formation across endless skies of clouds that tasted like ice cream, and children who turned medical appointments into adventures. And when she woke before dawn to prepare for her flight back to Boston, Clara felt as though she were carrying something precious with her, not just Mr. Zoom, but a new understanding of what it meant to live authentically. The flight back to Boston was everything the flight to Seattle hadn't been. Clara sat alone in first class, surrounded by business travelers focused on their laptops and phones, and felt the weight of returning to a world where efficiency mattered more than empathy, where success was measured in quarterly reports rather than quality of relationships. But Mr. Zoom sat on the tray table in front of her, a tangible reminder that other ways of being in the world were possible. Clara found herself telling the toy airplane about the clouds they passed through, rating them on Ethan's scale of 1 to 13, and imagining the boys' delighted commentary on their formations. The board meeting was as difficult as Clara had anticipated. The director's questions were sharp, their concern about her judgment palpable. She tried to explain her decision to prioritize personal relationships over professional obligations, but the words sounded hollow in the sterile conference room, surrounded by people who had built their careers on avoiding exactly the kind of emotional vulnerability she was describing. "So you're telling us," the board chairman said slowly, "that you deliberately sabotaged a crucial negotiation because you formed an attachment to strangers you met on an airplane." "I'm telling you," Clara replied carefully, "that I realized I was living a life that had no room for the things that actually matter. And that realization led me to make different choices." The silence that followed was heavy with disapproval and concern. Clara could see the directors exchanging glances, the kind of looks that preceded difficult conversations about leadership changes and succession planning. "Clara," one of the board members said finally, "we've all admired your dedication and professional focus over the years. That's exactly why this behavior is so concerning. Are you having some kind of personal crisis that's affecting your ability to lead this company?" The question echoed Henderson's concerns, and Clara realized that from their perspective, her actions did suggest instability. Leaders were supposed to compartmentalize to separate personal feelings from professional responsibilities. The idea that those boundaries might be artificial, that integration might be healthier than separation, was foreign to their understanding of corporate governance. "I'm having a crisis of priorities," Clara said finally. "I'm questioning whether the way I've been living my life is sustainable or meaningful, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing." The meeting ended with carefully worded statements about taking time to consider next steps and evaluate leadership effectiveness. Clara knew that her days as CEO were numbered, that the board would use her lapse in judgment as justification for changes they might have been contemplating anyway. But as she cleared out her office over the following weeks, as she navigated the awkward conversations and carefully managed transition of power, Clara found herself thinking constantly about Daniel and Ethan. She and Daniel exchanged emails, regularly updates on Ethan's treatment progress, photos of particularly impressive cloud formations, stories about their daily adventures in Seattle. The correspondence felt like a lifeline to the person she'd discovered she could be when she allowed herself to prioritize connection over achievement. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Clara received a call that changed everything. Ethan's voice was bright with excitement as he shared news that his latest test results had been even better than expected, that Dr. Martinez was cautiously optimistic about his long-term prognosis. "And guess what?" Ethan continued, barely pausing for breath. Daddy got offered a really big job working on a historic building in Boston. It's supposed to take 6 months, and we get to live there while he works on it. Daddy says we can see you all the time. Clara felt her heart skip as she processed this information. Daniel and Ethan were coming to Boston. They would be living in her city for 6 months, available for weekend adventures and weeknight dinners and all the ordinary moments that had felt so extraordinary during their day in Seattle. That's wonderful news, she managed, though wonderful felt inadequate to describe the surge of joy and anticipation flooding through her. Daddy wants to talk to you, Ethan said, and Clara heard the phone being transferred. Clara? Daniel's voice was warm but uncertain. I hope Ethan didn't ambush you with our news. I was going to call you myself later to discuss the logistics. Daniel. This is amazing, Clara said, abandoning any pretense of professional composure. When do you arrive? Where will you be staying? Do you need help finding schools for Ethan or doctors or anything else? Daniel's laugh was rich with relief. So you're happy about this development? Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Clara replied honestly. I've been thinking about you both every day since I left Seattle. The idea of having you here, of being able to be part of your daily life instead of just exchanging emails. Daniel, I can't think of anything that would make me happier. There was a pause, and when Daniel spoke again, his voice carried a note of vulnerability that made Clara's chest tighten. Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to feel completely free to say no if it doesn't feel right. Ask me anything. Would you like to have dinner with us when we get to Boston, I mean? Not just once, but regularly. As much as you want. Ethan keeps asking when he's going to see you again, and I keep telling him I don't know. But the truth is, I want to see you again too. More than I probably should want to see someone I've known for such a short time. Clara felt tears of relief and joy sliding down her cheeks. Daniel, yes. Yes to dinner, yes to seeing you regularly. Yes to whatever this is becoming between us. I've been hoping you'd ask. Really? Daniel's voice was soft with wonder. Because I keep thinking about that day in Seattle, about how right it felt to have you there with us. And I know it's complicated. You have your life and career, and we come with a lot of medical baggage and uncertainty. Daniel. Clara interrupted gently. My career isn't what it used to be. And as for the medical situation, I've learned something important over the past few weeks. Love isn't about finding someone without problems. It's about finding someone whose problems you want to help solve, whose joys you want to share, whose life you want to be part of, even when it's difficult. The words hung between them, an admission more honest than Clara had intended to make. She'd essentially confessed to falling in love with a man she'd known for a matter of weeks, based on one extraordinary day and a series of emails. It should have felt premature, overwhelming, potentially disastrous. Instead, it felt like the truest thing she'd ever said. Clara. Daniel's voice was thick with emotion. I love you too. I've been trying to talk myself out of it, telling myself it's too soon, too complicated, too risky. But Ethan was right. That first day, sometimes people find each other when they need it most. The next 6 months passed in a blur of rediscovered joy and gradual integration. Daniel's restoration work on a historic Beacon Hill mansion proved to be exactly the kind of detailed, meaningful labor he'd described, taking something old and broken and making it beautiful again. Clara, meanwhile, used her forced sabbatical from corporate leadership to explore different means of applying her skills, eventually launching a consulting firm that specialized in helping companies develop more sustainable and human-centered business practices. But the real transformation happened in the quiet moments between professional obligations. Sunday mornings spent in Boston Common watching Ethan feed ducks while Daniel and Clara talked about everything from architecture to philosophy to their shared dreams for the future. Weeknight dinners where Ethan regaled them with stories from his new school, where he'd quickly become popular for his encyclopedic knowledge of cloud formations and his ability to find the positive aspect of any situation. Medical appointments that Clara began attending as naturally as if she'd always been part of Ethan's support system, learning the rhythms of treatment schedules and blood tests, and the careful optimism that characterized conversations with pediatric oncologists. She discovered that love wasn't just about sharing joy, but about sharing fear and uncertainty, and the everyday anxieties that came with caring deeply about someone whose future held variables beyond anyone's control. But Ethan continued to thrive. His test results consistently positive. His energy and enthusiasm undimmed by the medical realities that structured his days. He adapted to Boston with the same grace he brought to everything else, turning their Cambridge apartment into a headquarters for expedition planning and cloud photography, and the ongoing adventures of Mr. Zoom, who had officially become a joint custody arrangement between Clara and Ethan. "I think Mr. Zoom likes having two homes," Ethan announced one evening, as they walked along the Charles River, the toy airplane tucked safely in Clara's jacket pocket. "He says it gives him more stories to tell." "What kind of stories?" Clara asked, delighting as always in Ethan's elaborate mythology around his beloved toy. "Stories about brave ladies who learn to choose love over meetings," Ethan said matter-of-factly. "And stories about how sometimes the best families are the ones you choose instead of the ones you're born with." Clara felt Daniel's hand find hers as they walked, and she marveled again at how natural this felt, this improvised family unit that had grown from a chance encounter on an airplane into something that felt both miraculous and inevitable. The conversation that would change everything happened on a crisp October evening, exactly 1 year after their first meeting. They were sitting in Clara's apartment, Ethan absorbed in a homework assignment about local history, while Clara and Daniel shared wine and conversation in the kitchen. "I've been thinking," Daniel said carefully, "about what happens when the restoration project ends, about whether we go back to Seattle or make different plans." Clara felt her heart skip, recognizing the weight behind his seemingly casual words. "What kind of different plans?" "The kind where we stay in Boston," Daniel said, meeting her eyes directly. "The kind where we make this official, this thing we've built together. The kind where I ask you to marry me and help me raise the most extraordinary kid in the world." Clara's breath caught, not because the proposal was unexpected, but because it felt like the natural culmination of everything they'd discovered together over the past year. "Daniel, I know it's complicated," he continued quickly. "I know that marrying me means signing up for medical uncertainties and single-parent exhaustion and a ready-made family that comes with a lot of history. I know I'm asking you to completely rearrange your life for people you've known for a relatively short time. You're asking me to rearrange my life for the people who taught me how to live it," Clara replied, tears streaming down her face. "Daniel, yes. Yes to marriage, yes to being Ethan's stepmother, yes to whatever challenges and joys come with loving you both." Ethan looked up from his homework at that moment, taking in the emotional scene with the quick understanding that characterized all his observations. "Are you going to be my mama now?" he asked Clara, his voice small but hopeful. Clara knelt down to his level, remembering another conversation in a hospital waiting room when he'd asked her directly about loneliness. "Would you like me to be?" "Yes," Ethan said simply. "I've been wishing for that since the airplane day. I wished for it on the Space Needle and when we saw the airplane families, and on every birthday candle since then." "Then yes," Clara said, pulling him into a hug that felt like coming home. "I would love to be your mama. I would love to be part of your family officially." The wedding took place 6 months later on the shores of Lake Washington in Seattle, with Dr. Martinez serving as an honorary witness and Mr. Zoom holding a special place of honor as ring bearer. Ethan's latest test results had shown continued improvement, and he'd been cleared to ring the bell at Children's Hospital, a celebration of treatment milestones that had left not a dry eye in the oncology ward. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the reception, when Ethan stood up to give an impromptu speech that reduced the entire gathering to tears. "I want to thank everybody for coming to celebrate our family getting bigger," he said, his 7-year-old voice carrying clearly across the assembled guests. "And I want to thank the airplane that brought Clara to us and the clouds that day, that were definitely 13s, and Mr. Zoom for being brave enough to help a scared lady learn how to choose love over business meetings." As laughter and applause filled the reception hall, Clara caught Daniel's eye across the room and felt the same sense of wonder she'd experienced that first day on the observation deck of the Space Needle. Sometimes people found each other when they needed it most. Sometimes airplane families were more than just formation flying. Sometimes the best adventures were indeed the ones you didn't plan for. 3 years later, Clara would look back on that collision at Gate 17 as the moment her real life began. Not her professional life or her successful life or her carefully planned life, but her real life, the one measured in shared laughter and medical milestones, celebrated in bedtime stories and homework help, and the 1,000 small moments that comprised a family's daily rhythm. Mr. Zoom still occupied a place of honor in their home, now joined by a collection of other toy airplanes that Ethan had acquired to keep him company. But the original red airplane remained special, a tangible reminder of the courage required to choose authenticity over achievement, love over logic, connection over control. And on clear afternoons when the clouds formed particularly impressive formations over Boston Harbor, the three of them would stand together on their apartment balcony, rating them on a scale that now extended well beyond 13, sharing stories about airplane families and the extraordinary adventures that began with the simple act of reaching out to hold someone's hand during turbulence. Ethan, now 10 years old and officially in remission, had grown into an even more remarkable child, still wise beyond his years, but now with the added confidence that came from being deeply loved and securely rooted in a family that had chosen each other deliberately and completely. He talked about becoming a doctor someday, or maybe a pilot, or possibly both, so he could help sick kids travel to the best hospitals in flying machines that were never scary because they were guided by love. And Clara, who had once measured success in quarterly reports and market share, now measured it in the sound of Ethan's laughter echoing through their home, in the warmth of Daniel's hand in hers as they walked through Boston Common on Sunday mornings, in the knowledge that she had built something real and lasting and beautiful from the wreckage of her carefully controlled life. The chipped red airplane had been right all along. Sometimes the best flights were the ones that took you places you never planned to go to. Destinations you didn't even know existed until you found yourself there, holding hands with people who became your chosen family, somewhere above the clouds, in the space between where you started and where you finally learned to call home.